They said Crown Duke Vaelor Draven never lost. Not battles, not negotiations, not women. The man had carved 3 enemy nations into tribute states before his 30th year, and every court in the known empire spoke his name the way people speak about weather, with a kind of helpless acceptance that it simply was, and that arguing against it served no purpose. So when his wedding night became the most spectacular act of public cruelty anyone in Aurethia had witnessed in a generation, the court didn't gasp. They watched, they catalogued, they whispered among themselves that the new Duchess Draven had made one fatal miscalculation. She had believed, somewhere deep in that composed Valacrest spine, that marriage to a conqueror meant she was no longer the conquered. She was wrong, and now she was gone, and the ledger, the one that could burn everything, had gone with her. The wedding had been arranged in the manner of all great imperial arrangements, with the specific aesthetic of inevitability. No one in the Aurethian court had asked whether Seraphine Valacrest wanted to become Duchess Draven. The question would have been considered peculiar, the kind of thing asked by people who didn't understand how power organized itself, how the empire's great houses moved their daughters, the way generals moved infantry, not with cruelty necessarily, but with the absolute disregard of those who have never once been required to consider another person's interior life. Seraphine had received the imperial decree on a Tuesday morning, read it twice at the window of her family estate in the northern Valecrest territory, folded it with the precise care of someone who understood that visible emotion was a luxury she could no longer afford, and begun preparing. She had 3 months. In 3 months, she packed 22 years of a carefully constructed life into a set of trunks that the imperial couriers would deem appropriate, dismissed the household staff she had known since childhood with the kind of farewell that cost her more than she allowed her face to show, and rode south through the autumn-stripped countryside toward the capital with her spine so straight it looked architectural. What the court saw when she arrived was a woman of remarkable composure. What the court failed to understand, because courts, by their nature, are institutions devoted to surface reading, was that Seraphine Valacrest had not spent 22 years in the northern territories being merely decorative. Her father had died when she was 9. Her mother had followed 3 years later. What remained was the estate, 40,000 acres of difficult land, a staff of 70, and a child who had to decide, with the brutal pragmatism available only to those with no remaining alternatives, exactly who she intended to become. She had chosen accountant, strategist, record keeper. She had learned the language of debts and leverage before she learned to dance. She could read a financial contract faster than most imperial ministers could sign one, and she understood, in the marrow-deep way that only orphans develop, that information was the only currency that never depreciated. But she arrived in the capital carrying nothing that looked like power. She arrived looking exactly like what they needed her to be: composed, presentable, politically useful. Vaelor Draven did not greet her himself. He sent his steward. The Cathedral of Aurethia had stood for 200 years, and in those 200 years it had witnessed coronations, executions, and 14 imperial weddings. The architecture was designed with specific intention, to make the human body feel small. The vaulted ceilings rose 40 meters toward carved stone. The aisles stretched so long that the far end blurred in candlelight, and the assembled court occupied tiered galleries on either side, so that the couple at the altar performed, whether they chose to or not, for an audience of 600. 600 people watched Vaelor Draven stand at that altar. He was the kind of man who occupied space differently than other men, not merely because of height, though he had that, 6 feet 3 inches of a frame built by 15 years of active military command, shoulders that had filled out a general's uniform before most men his age had grown into their faces. It was something else. A stillness. The way a predator holds stillness, not because nothing is happening internally, but because everything happening internally has been routed through the discipline of absolute control. He stood at that altar in the imperial black of House Draven, with the imperial order ribbons at his chest, and his dark hair swept back from a face that the court's painters had spent years trying to accurately render, and largely failed, because what they kept missing was the quality of the eyes. Not cold exactly. Something worse than cold. Cold implied the absence of heat. Vaelor Draven's eyes implied that heat had once been present, and something deliberate had been done about it. He watched Seraphine come down the aisle. She came with the measured pace of a woman who has rehearsed this moment and found it wanting but proceeded anyway, her ivory gown trailing 4 meters of Valacrest ivory silk across stone floors that had seen better blood than hers. She looked, the court would later agree in their various recounting, magnificent. The bone structure, the posture, the way she held her face in an expression of serene composure that most women would have had to practice for a decade to achieve. She reached him. He did not offer his hand immediately. He studied her for a moment with the flat assessment of a man evaluating a strategic asset, and the court held its breath in the particular way of people who sense theater developing, and then he extended his hand and she took it, and the ceremony began. It lasted 90 minutes. Seraphine said every word correctly. She had memorized the Aurethian imperial rite 3 weeks prior, considered the text carefully for any implication she was unwilling to accept, found several, and decided with the cold arithmetic of survival that this was not the moment to fight that particular battle. She said the words. She accepted the seal ring that made her Duchess Draven with a steadiness of hand that a surgeon would have respected. She stood beside this man she had never spoken a full sentence to and performed the ceremony with the precision of someone who has understood, from a very young age, that performance is sometimes the only form of power available to you. What she did not allow herself to do was look at Lady Morel Voss. Morel occupied the third gallery seat on the left, which was 2 positions beyond what her rank technically entitled her to, a fact that anyone with Seraphine's knowledge of court protocol recognized instantly and which had been noted without visible reaction. She was everything the court considered devastating. Dark red hair arranged with expensive carelessness, a face that painters had actually managed to capture correctly because it was the kind of face that cooperated with being admired, and a gown in imperial crimson that was, by any reasonable reading of the color, a statement. She watched the ceremony with the particular expression of a woman who considers herself the true protagonist of a story in which someone else is currently speaking the lines. Vaelor had not looked at Seraphine during the vows. He had looked straight ahead. The wedding feast occupied the grand hall of the imperial palace, 300 feet of white stone tables, 14 chandeliers burning 1,000 candles each, and the assembled nobility of Aurethia in their best performance of celebratory loyalty. The toast began before the first course was cleared. Lord Commander Hayth, who was 70 years old and had served 4 dukes before this one, raised a glass of Sarathian wine and declared that the empire was stronger for this union, and that Duchess Draven was a woman of formidable grace. Seraphine inclined her head and accepted the toast and ate exactly what was placed before her and said the words required at the intervals they were required and observed everything. She observed, for instance, that Morel had been seated in the 4th tier of the high tables. Technically correct, her position as Lady Voss entitled her to nothing higher, and yet she was there, present at a table she had no political justification to occupy, and no one had moved her. Seraphine observed the way certain ministers' eyes tracked between Morel's table and the head table with the practiced neutrality of men who had made their choice and were comfortable with it. She observed the way Vaelor's steward, a thin, quiet man named Aldrich, who carried himself with the careful invisibility of someone who hears everything and repeats only what is useful, moved between tables with the pattern of a man executing instructions rather than managing logistics. She observed her husband. Vaelor ate without particular appetite and drank with the controlled precision of a man who does not intend to be anything other than precisely as sober as he chooses. He spoke to the Lord Commander on his left with the brief economic language of military men who respect each other's time. He nodded at the appropriate moments during toasts. He performed the role of groom with the same quality of engagement that a senior general brings to a diplomatic reception, technically present, substantively elsewhere. He had spoken 4 sentences to her since the ceremony. She had been counting. The feast was entering its 3rd hour when the thing happened. Seraphine had been watching it build for 20 minutes because she had been watching everything, and she had noted the particular quality of attention that Morel's table had been developing, a kind of coiled preparedness, the way a room shifts slightly before a confrontation that everyone can feel coming but no one is willing to name. She had noted the moment when Morel glanced toward the head table with an expression that was not admiration and not hostility, but something more specifically calibrated, an assessment of timing. Morel rose from her seat. She did not approach the head table through the side corridor, the way protocol dictated for those not seated at the primary tier. She came down the central aisle. The central aisle, which was technically reserved for the host party and the most senior imperial guests, which Lady Morel Voss was not. The room noticed. The room always noticed. That was the point. She stopped beside Vaelor. He looked up, and the expression on his face, the expression that Seraphine watched with the same flat clinical attention she brought to reading a financial report that contained information she had already anticipated but needed to see confirmed in writing, was not surprise. It was not annoyance. It was the expression of a man who has anticipated something and is deciding in real time whether to perform the socially required response or to simply not bother. He did not bother. "Morel," he said, and his voice had a different quality in it than it had held in any of the 4 sentences he had directed at his wife. Something with texture in it, something with history. "My Lord Duke," she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who has practiced this exact moment and found it deeply satisfying. "Forgive the interruption. I wished only to offer my congratulations on such a momentous occasion." "You're forgiven," he said. He did not tell her to return to her table. The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, 600 people recalibrated their understanding of the evening. Seraphine watched it happen. She watched the shift in faces, the careful blankness that dropped over certain courtiers like a professional mask, the suppressed hunger in others who recognized that they were witnessing something that would be discussed for weeks. The specific quality of discomfort in Lord Commander Haith's expression that looked very much like the embarrassment of a man watching someone he respects behave badly. Then Morel turned to look at Seraphine. She did it slowly, the way people execute gestures they've rehearsed. "Duchess Draven," she said, with the tone of someone extending a courtesy so exaggerated it curdles into insult. "You are everything the court has said." The silence that followed had a particular temperature. Every word available to Seraphine in that moment was a trap. She understood this with the clarity of long practice. Warmth would be weakness, hostility would be spectacle, dismissal would be deflected. The court was watching with the specific attention of people who want to see how prey handles a predator's paw on its throat, and the correct response, the response that would satisfy no one, and therefore serve only her, was the one that cost nothing. "Lady Voss," Seraphine said. Her voice was entirely level. "I'm glad to have the chance to put a face to the name." The deliberate neutrality of it landed like a stone in still water, and Morel held her expression for 3 seconds before the first microfracture appeared at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite its absence. And she turned back to Vaelor and said something quiet, something that Seraphine was not meant to hear. And Vaelor made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh, and Morel moved away. Not back to her table. She moved to a position 2 chairs down from Seraphine's end of the head table, where she was immediately joined by 2 of her attendants, and she stayed there for the remainder of the feast. Seraphine ate her dessert with a completely steady hand. The bridal suite occupied the east tower of the imperial palace, which was the oldest part of the structure and had been renovated 3 times in 100 years without ever quite losing the quality of its original walls. Stone that held cold the way history holds its grievances, with a kind of impersonal permanence. The room itself was dressed for the occasion. Beeswax candles burning in 12-branch candelabras. The great bed dressed in Draven black and Valecrest ivory. Imported flowers that had cost more than a minor lord's quarterly income, arranged in 3 massive vases near the arched windows that looked out over the capital's nighttime silhouette. 2 attendants had prepared Seraphine, helped her out of the ceremony gown, and into a dressing robe of Valecrest ivory silk, brushed her dark hair until it lay smooth down her back, and then quietly withdrawn with the professional expressionlessness of palace staff, who have been in these rooms before and understand that the correct posture is invisibility. She sat at the window. The capital spread below her, lamplight in 10,000 windows, the distant sound of celebration still rising from the lower city where the people were marking the Imperial Union with exactly the kind of enthusiasm that required free Imperial ale. And she watched it with the specific attention of a woman who is not seeing a city but thinking through a problem. The black ledger was in its case in the third trunk of her personal luggage, which was stored in the adjacent dressing room behind a door that locked from the inside, which she had noted upon arrival and considered carefully. She had been carrying the ledger for 6 weeks. She had found it in the Valecrest Estate archives 6 weeks before her departure, in a crate of her father's documents that no one had opened in 14 years, and she had known, from the first 15 pages, exactly what she was holding. She had read it twice. She had memorized every name. The door to the bridal suite opened without a knock. Vaelor Draven came through it with the same quality of presence he carried everywhere. That particular displacement of air that large men with authority have, the sense that the room had reorganized itself slightly to accommodate him, and he stopped when he saw her at the window. He had removed the ceremony coat and the order ribbons. He was in his shirt and trousers, his dark hair slightly disordered, and in the reduced formality of it he looked, for the first time, less like an institutional force and more like a man, a tired one. He looked at her for a moment. "You're still dressed," he said. "I didn't know when to expect you," she said. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." The silence had a particular texture. He moved to the side table where a decanter of something dark had been set and poured 2 fingers without looking at her, drank it, put the glass down. "This doesn't have to be complicated," he said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." Something in the directness of it made him look at her again, and she held the eye contact with the steady patience of a woman who has decided to understand exactly who she is dealing with before she makes another move. "You handled yourself tonight," he said. The phrasing was careful. Not a compliment exactly. An assessment. "Did you expect otherwise?" "I didn't expect anything," he said. "I don't make expectations about people I don't know." "That's almost admirably honest," she said. His expression shifted by approximately nothing, but she had the sense that something had registered. He moved to the second window, stood with his hands loose at his sides, looking at the same city she'd been watching. Up close, and this was the first time they had been genuinely close, alone, without the cathedral or the feast between them. He was more complicated than distance allowed. The lines at the corners of his eyes had been built by something harder than age. The set of his jaw was the particular set of a man who has made a habit of deciding things and not reconsidering. "Morel will continue to be present at court," he said. Not an apology. A fact. The delivery of a position he had decided in advance and was now communicating as a matter of efficiency. "I assumed as much," Seraphine said. "You won't make trouble about it." "Is that a question?" "It's a statement of what I need." She turned to look at him fully. He was watching her with those flat, appraising eyes, and she thought, not for the first time that evening, but with a new and specific quality of clarity, that she was looking at a man who had won so consistently for so long that he had stopped being able to imagine a set of conditions under which he might not. "Then let me offer you one in return," she said. "I am not trouble, Duke Draven. I am not a problem requiring management, and I am not an inconvenience to be administered. I have come here in good faith, in compliance with an imperial decree that I did not request, and I have no interest in making your life difficult." She paused. "But I am also not furniture." He held her gaze. "No," he said after a moment. "You're not." Something in that acknowledgement was not quite what she'd expected, and she filed it the way she filed everything, carefully, for later use, and said nothing else, and he said nothing else. And eventually he left and the door closed behind him and she sat alone in the bridal suite of the Imperial Palace on her wedding night, with the black ledger 3 feet away and 600 people's worth of information in her head. And she began, with the methodical patience of a woman who has spent 22 years learning to plan in hostile conditions, to think about what came next. Bas. The following morning came gray. The capital's early autumn had the specific quality of weather that hasn't decided yet. Not cold enough for fire, not warm enough for comfort, the kind of morning that discourages certainty. Seraphine had slept in the 3-hour interval between 3 and 6, which was her custom when she was working through something, and she had risen in the dark and sat at the window again and watched the city come awake with the first gray light, the lamplighters doing their morning rounds in reverse, and she had thought. She had her first official obligation at the 9th hour, a formal breakfast with the Aurethian Senate Social Committee and 3 members of the Imperial Banking Council, an introductory meeting designed to establish her as a functioning court presence. She had her second obligation at the 11th, a meeting with the palace's household steward, who would brief her on her duties as Duchess and Mistress of the East Wing. Both meetings would require exactly the version of herself that the court needed to see: composed, unremarkable, a duchess in the process of settling into her role. She prepared herself with the same precision she brought to everything. The Senate breakfast was in the yellow drawing room on the 2nd floor, a room with 3 east-facing windows and furniture upholstered in a shade of gold that had seemed expensive 30 years ago, and now merely looked tired. The committee members were already assembled when she arrived: 3 lords and 2 ladies of the secondary tier, the kind of people who derive their status from institutional proximity rather than independent power, and who therefore study newcomers with the particular sharpness of those who know that alliances require early investment. Senator Borean, who was 63, red-faced, and possessed of the specific confidence of a man who has been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 2 decades, rose when she entered. The others followed. "Duchess Draven," he said, "what a pleasure. We have been so looking forward to getting to know you." "Senator Borean," she said, "the feeling is mutual." The pleasantries took 11 minutes. She was very good at pleasantries. She had learned long ago that the purpose of pleasantry is not social warmth, but information extraction, that a person doing correctly performed small talk will, if you listen with the right quality of attention, tell you almost everything relevant about their concerns, their loyalties, and their fears within the first 15 minutes of a conversation. Senator Borean was worried about the eastern trade routes. Lady Marchand was worried about her son's military posting. Banking Councilman Frath, who was 57 and had the eyes of a man who had spent his life around numbers that didn't add up, was worried about something he was not going to mention at a social breakfast. She noted all of it. The conversation moved, with the predictability of these things, toward the wedding. "A magnificent ceremony," Lady Marchand offered, with the tone of someone establishing safe ground. "The Duke looked very well." "He did," Seraphine agreed. "And you, Duchess, forgive my saying so, but the composure you displayed all evening, quite remarkable given—" She stopped, with the particular stop of a woman who has started a sentence without securing its landing. "Given?" Seraphine said pleasantly. The table had the quality of held breath. "Given the long day," Lady Marchand completed, with the smile of someone who has just completed a diplomatic retreat and is mildly embarrassed by its visibility. "It was a long day," Seraphine agreed, "though a meaningful one." Senator Borean, who was too direct to be tactful and too confident to care about the difference, leaned forward slightly. "You should know, Duchess, that many of us were—well, we were watching you last night with a great deal of interest. How you handled Lady Voss's rather unexpected presence at the high table." "I wasn't aware I handled anything in particular," Seraphine said. "That," he said, with what appeared to be genuine respect, "is exactly what I mean." She accepted the implicit compliment with a modest incline of her head and moved the conversation to the trade routes, which was what he actually wanted to discuss, and spent the next 40 minutes gathering information that she would not appear to be gathering, and left the breakfast with a precise catalogue of who in the Senate was attached to which financial interest, and which of those interests had reason to be anxious. The name Mirelle Voss appeared, indirectly, 4 times. She counted. The household briefing ran long. Aldrich, the steward, Vaelor's steward, a thin man of indeterminate age whose face had the quality of something carved to display a single expression and then left, conducted it with the meticulous efficiency of someone who considers thoroughness a moral category. The East Wing had 43 rooms. The household staff numbered 68. The accounts were maintained quarterly. The kitchen operated under a senior chef who had come from the Imperial Academy 17 years prior. The security arrangements for the Duchess's personal quarters were— "Aldrich," she said. He paused. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been interrupted but is too professional to display his reaction to it. "Yes, Your Grace." "How long have you served Duke Draven?" A pause. Brief. Almost imperceptible. 11 years, Your Grace." "And before him?" Another pause. "I served in various administrative capacities." "For whom?" "Several houses," he said. "The late Duke Draven's household. Briefly, the Banking Council's administrative staff." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Please continue." He continued. She listened with the front part of her attention and thought with the rest. 11 years, which meant he had been in place through Vaelor's military ascent, through the 2 wars, through the consolidation of imperial authority that had made Vaelor Draven the most powerful non-imperial figure in Aurethia. Briefly, the Banking Council's administrative staff, which was interesting because the Banking Council's administrative staff was not a natural transit point for household stewards, which meant the direction of travel had been unusual, which meant there was a story she didn't have yet. She would have it. That afternoon, she walked the East Wing alone. She took 3 hours, which was longer than anyone expected, and she moved through each of 43 rooms with the systematic attention of an estate manager conducting an inventory, which was essentially what she was doing. She was cataloging exits. She was counting windows and their relation to the exterior walls. She was noting which corridors connected to which, and where the natural blind spots were in the servants' traffic patterns, and which of the secondary stairwells had been recently used based on the condition of the stone. She was not planning to run, not yet. She was planning to understand exactly what she had walked into. The first week passed in the architecture of performance. She attended the breakfasts and the meetings and the 3 formal dinners that the calendar demanded, and she wore the appropriate gowns and said the appropriate things and watched Vaelor Draven move through his world with the confident efficiency of a man who has never had serious reason to doubt that his world would continue to arrange itself around his needs. He was not unkind to her in these public settings. He was something more difficult, indifferent. The kind of indifference that is not hostile but that communicates, with complete precision, that you are not a variable being considered in the calculation. She ate that information and kept moving. She began, in those first 7 days, a private ledger. Not the black ledger, which stayed locked in its case, which she had moved to a different location on the 3rd day and a second different location on the 5th. Her own ledger. A slim volume in the Valecrest Estates accounting shorthand, which was a system her father's bookkeeper had developed 50 years prior and which she had learned at age 11 and which would be entirely unintelligible to anyone who hadn't been trained in it. She wrote in it every evening after the household retired, by the light of a single candle at the window desk, and she recorded in it with the meticulous precision of an accountant who understands that the value of a record is in its accuracy and its completeness. Names, dates, connections, financial references, the indirect statements, and the careful omissions, and the things that people's bodies said when their mouths were saying something else. Morel Voss's name appeared with increasing frequency, not because Morel was increasing her presence. She was, in fact, operating with a kind of surface restraint since the wedding feast, the restraint of someone who has made her point and is now content to let it resonate. But the name was appearing in other places, in Senator Borean's references to certain banking arrangements, in the household accounts, in a pattern of expenditure that was regular enough to be operational rather than occasional. In a conversation she had overheard, fragmentarily, between 2 lords in the library corridor on Thursday afternoon, a conversation that had ended abruptly when they became aware of her presence and had shifted with the particular mechanical smoothness of men who practice that shift. What Seraphine was constructing in that slim volume in Valecrest shorthand was a map. Not a map of the imperial palace, a map of the structure beneath it, the architecture of arrangement that held Aurethia's visible power in place while doing the actual work of it somewhere else, in rooms that didn't appear on official plans, in conversations that didn't appear in official records. She had spent 2 weeks with the Black Ledger before arriving in the capital. She knew what the map was supposed to look like. She was verifying. But on the 9th day, Vaelor came to her rooms in the afternoon, not the nighttime formality of the first visit. Afternoon, when the East Wing was quiet and the light came through the windows at a low angle that gave everything the quality of old gold. He knocked this time. She said, "Come in," and he came in and stopped in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided to do something and hasn't quite resolved the approach. She was at the desk. She closed the book she had been reading, not the slim ledger, which was in the locked drawer. This was a volume of Aurethian trade law that she had requested from the palace library, and which had arrived with an accompanying note from Aldrich, indicating that it was an unusual request, and waited. "I have a military council meeting that will run through the weekend," he said. "I wanted you to know in advance." She looked at him. "That's—" she started. "There's a situation developing in the eastern provinces. I won't bore you with the details." "I'd like the details," she said. He paused. This was not what he had come to say, and she watched him recalibrate in real time, which was interesting because it indicated that recalibration was, for him, a slightly unfamiliar process. "It's a military matter," he said, with the tone of a man who considers this an explanation. "I run 40,000 acres of Valacrest territory that borders the eastern provinces," she said. "What happens there affects my people, who are now, technically, imperial subjects under your protection. I'd like the details." The silence had a specific quality, but not hostile, not quite. Something more like the silence of a man encountering a fact he hadn't included in his calculation and taking a moment to incorporate it. "There have been disruptions to the supply lines," he said, finally. 3 depots in the northeastern sector have reported irregular deliveries. The military council believes it's a coordination failure in the logistics chain." "Is that what you believe?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. "What would you know about military logistics?" he said. "I know that a coordination failure in a logistics chain typically produces random irregularity," she said. 3 specific depots in one sector sounds more like selective disruption, which suggests someone who knows the chain well enough to target it precisely. The silence this time was different, longer. "You've been reading the trade law volumes," he said. "I've been reading everything I can find," she said. He studied her for a long moment, and she let herself be studied because that was fine, that cost her nothing, because what he was looking at was only the surface, and the surface was what she wanted him to see. "I'll have Aldrich send you the summary reports," he said. "Thank you." He moved toward the door, stopped. "The composure you showed at the feast," he said without turning around. "Borean mentioned it." "Senator Borean is kind." "Borean doesn't do kind," he said. "He does useful. He told me you were sharp." She said nothing. "I'm not sure yet whether that's a complication," he said. "I'm not sure yet either," she said. He left. She sat for a moment in the space he had vacated and thought about the logistics chain and the 3 depots and the name she had seen twice in the Black Ledger in connection with a series of supply contracts that ran through a holding company that, if you traced it far enough through 3 layers of corporate structure, ended at a woman who kept a set of rooms in the Imperial Palace's West Wing and had stood in the central aisle of the Grand Hall and said, "You are everything the court has said." Then she opened the locked drawer and took out the slim volume and wrote for 20 minutes before locking it away again. On the 13th night, she found the cipher. She had been working through the Black Ledger with a methodical patience that would have impressed her father's bookkeeper, cross-referencing entries against the summary reports that Aldrich had indeed sent, 2 days after the conversation in her sitting room, in a sealed packet delivered without comment. The reports were formal military logistics documents, dense with the specific jargon of supply chain administration, and they required no particular literacy in military affairs to read correctly if you understood financial documents, which she did. The cipher was in the margin of the ledger's 47th page. Her father's hand she recognized, though faint. He had been ill the year he wrote it, and the tremor was beginning. It looked like an annotation, a series of notations that appeared on first reading to be standard accounting references. She had passed it 4 times without registering it as distinct. On the 5th reading, working in the specific late-night state of attention that comes after 3 hours of focus when the mind starts seeing patterns it missed in ordinary consciousness, she stopped. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took a sheet of paper and began to translate. It took 2 hours. What emerged, in the careful unwinding of her father's encoded notation, was a list. 23 names. Against each name, a number. Against each number, a date range and a set of abbreviated references that she recognized now that she had been in the capital for 2 weeks, as corresponding to specific positions in the imperial administration, Senate seats, banking appointments, military commands. She read the list 3 times. Her hand, when she set the pen down, was not entirely steady, not because of the number of names. She had expected the names to be significant. She had expected, based on the 2 weeks of observation and the 2 weeks of pre-arrival reading, that the ledger's contents would be damaging. Her father had been a careful man, a meticulous man, the kind of man who did not keep documents unless they were worth keeping. What she had not fully anticipated was how far up the list went. Senator Borean's name was not on it. That was something. But 6 of the 8 banking council members were, and 4 military commanders whose names she recognized from the summary reports, and 2 names that made her sit for several minutes in the candlelit silence of the East Wing while the Capitol slept 3 stories below, thinking about the specific geometry of what she was holding and what it meant about the world she had been delivered into. She thought about Aldrich, who had briefly worked for the banking council's administrative staff. She thought about Vaelor Draven, who had won 3 wars and consolidated an empire, and who might be, she was now calculating with cold precision, either the architect of what the ledger described or the most valuable and dangerous instrument deployed by those who were. She thought about her father, who had spent the last year of his life in a study in the northern estate, ill and frightened and writing things in encoded margins that he had never told her about, that she had found by accident in a crate 14 years after he died. And she thought about why he had been afraid and whether his illness had been entirely natural and whether she had been sent to this palace, in this marriage, not entirely at random. She closed the ledger. She sat for a very long time looking at nothing. Then she rose and moved to the dressing room where the luggage was stored and checked, with the specific careful efficiency of a woman who has been checking this every evening for 2 weeks, that the case was still in its hidden position, that the lock was undisturbed, that no one had been in the room while she slept. Everything was as she had left it. She went back to the desk and sat down and wrote in the slim volume for 45 minutes, and when she was done, she locked it away and went to the window and looked at the city for a long time. The question she was working through was not whether to act. That had been settled in the northern estate, in the moment she had read the first 15 pages of the Black Ledger, and understood what her father had died knowing. The question was when. The question was how. The question was which of the 23 names needed to be moved against first, and which needed to be preserved as evidence, and whether the man she had married was something she could use or something she needed to get away from before he understood what she was holding. Outside, a lamplighter was making his rounds. The capital was quiet. Somewhere in the palace's west wing, Seraphine was fairly certain, a woman with dark red hair and imperial crimson gowns was lying awake in her own set of rooms, running her own calculations, and the fact of that parallel planning in this specific shared space had a quality to it, a quality of 2 opposing logics existing in the same system, and the absolute certainty that systems could only tolerate that for so long before something had to give. She watched the lamplighter finish his circuit and disappear around the corner. Then she went to bed because she needed to sleep, because tomorrow she had a meeting with the Banking Council's quarterly review committee, and the questions she was preparing to ask were going to require a very steady face. She slept for exactly 3 hours. She was still asleep when, at the 6th hour of the following morning, she was woken by a sound. Not a loud sound. Something subtle. The specific creak of a floorboard in the outer corridor that had a particular quality. Not the sound of normal palace movement. Not the sound of early staff, but the sound of someone moving with deliberate care. Which is to say the sound of someone who does not want to be heard. Which is to say the sound that a woman who has spent 22 years managing a large estate learns, in the bone, to distinguish from ordinary noise. She was fully awake in 4 seconds. She lay still. The sound did not repeat. She counted to 60. Nothing. She rose, moved to the dressing room with bare feet on cold stone, checked the case, still locked, still undisturbed, and stood in the darkness of the dressing room for another long minute, listening to a palace that had returned to its normal pre-dawn silence. Then she moved to the locked drawer, opened it, removed the slim volume and the black ledger, and held both of them in the dark. She had been in the capital for 14 days. She had a meeting with the banking council at the 9th hour. She had 23 names and a cipher that her father had written with a shaking hand in the last year of his life. And somewhere in this palace, someone had just walked past her door at 6 in the morning on bare or soft-soled feet, and had chosen, for reasons she did not yet know, not to knock. She stood in the darkness with both ledgers in her hands and felt, for the first time since arriving in the capital, the specific sharpening that comes when you understand that the timeline you've been building has just been revised by someone else's hand. She needed to move faster, and she needed to do it before whoever had walked past that door figured out what she was holding. She never made it to the banking council meeting. She was gone before the 9th hour, before the lamplighters finished their morning rounds, before Vaelor Draven woke and found that the east wing was entirely, completely, inexplicably empty. No trunks, no attendants, no wife. Only the case where the black ledger had been stored, open and hollow. And on the desk where she had sat for 14 nights, writing in shorthand that no one in this palace could read, a single sheet of paper with 4 words in a hand so steady it looked carved, "You never asked why." The note stayed on the desk for 6 minutes before Vaelor picked it up. He had stood in the doorway of the empty East Wing suite for those 6 minutes doing nothing, which was unusual for him, because Vaelor Draven was not a man who stood in doorways doing nothing. He was a man who assessed and moved, who identified the variable and eliminated it, who had learned, across 15 years of military command, that the space between recognition and response was where campaigns were lost, and he had compressed that space in himself down to something that his officers described as frightening, and his enemies described, in their final moments, as simply inevitable. He stood in the doorway for 6 minutes. The room was so empty it had a quality of insult to it. Not stripped. That was the first thing he noted when the initial shock of absence had processed through him and the analytical part of his mind reasserted its professional control. Not the empty of a woman who had panicked and fled with what she could carry. The trunks were gone. The attendants were gone. 22 years of a woman's life, packed into whatever it had been packed into, moved out of this room with a logistical efficiency that suggested, and here was where the 6 minutes started accruing weight, that it had been planned. Not improvised. Planned. He walked to the desk and read the note. You never asked why. He read it twice, put it down, picked it up again. The thing about those 4 words was their specific quality of patience, not rage, not grief, not the desperate parting shot of a woman who had been humiliated and was extracting what dignity she could from the exit. Patient, deliberate. The words of someone who had decided at some prior point that this was how the conversation would end and had prepared accordingly. He had underestimated her. That thought arrived with a physical sensation, something in the chest, something that was not quite what he would call emotion, but was the body's acknowledgement of a significant miscalculation. He had looked at Seraphine Valicrest across a cathedral aisle and a wedding feast and 14 days of obligatory proximity, and he had processed her, as he processed most things that were given to him rather than fought for, as a constant, as a fixed variable, as a political arrangement that required management rather than attention. He had been wrong. He left the note on the desk and walked to the window and looked at the capital waking up below, and he thought about what she had taken. Well, Aldrich was in his office on the ground floor when Vaelor came through the door without knocking, which was how Vaelor came through most doors, and the steward rose from his desk with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who has spent 11 years learning to read the specific quality of his employer's silences. He read this one correctly. "Your Grace," he said. "The Duchess left before dawn," Vaelor said. "I want to know how." Aldrich's expression did not change, which told Vaelor something. Not guilt exactly. More the careful blankness of a man who has been anticipating a conversation and has prepared himself for its arrival. "I was not aware." "No." Vaelor moved to the window of the office and stood with his back to Aldrich, which was something he did when he wanted the other person to understand that eye contact was not being offered as a courtesy. You weren't aware. That's the problem. You run this household. 6 staff members helped move a duchess and her complete possessions out of the East Wing between midnight and the 6th hour, and you weren't aware. The silence from behind him had a particular texture. I will investigate immediately. I want names by the 2nd hour. He turned. And Aldrich. Your Grace. If I find that there is anything about the Duchess's activities in this palace that you were aware of and chose not to bring to me, he said, with the specific quiet that his officers recognized as far more dangerous than his raised voice, the conversation we have about that will be very different from this one. Aldrich held his gaze with the careful steadiness of a man who is calculating something. Of course, Your Grace. Vaelor left. The military council met at the 2nd hour in the war room, which was what Vaelor called the long stone chamber on the north side of the palace that had maps on 3 walls and a table that could seat 40, but currently held 6. Lord Commander Hayth was already seated when Vaelor arrived, along with Generals Corvath and Marin, and the 3 men read the quality of his entrance with the professional accuracy of soldiers who have served under him long enough to understand that the specific way he walked through a door communicated information about the degree of problem they were about to discuss. The Duchess is gone, Vaelor said. He sat at the head of the table. She left before dawn. She took her possessions and whatever else she found worth taking, and she did it with a level of logistical competence that suggests she has been planning this since before she arrived. Hayth, who was 70 and had earned the right to say difficult things directly, said, "What else did she take?" "That's what I'm determining." "Vaelor." The old man's voice had the register of someone choosing his words with specific care. "The woman came from the Valecrest estate. Her father was... Your father and his had a complicated history. There were documents. I know my father's history. Do you know what Aldrich knows about it?" The room had a quality of held breath. Vaelor looked at Hayth for a long moment. The old man's face was doing the thing it did when he was saying something he decided needed to be said regardless of reception. A kind of deliberate stillness, the face of a man planting a flag and waiting to see if the ground would hold. "Say what you're saying," Vaelor said. "Aldrich came to this household from the Banking Council's administrative staff," Hayth said. 11 years ago, which is also the year that 3 specific supply contracts were restructured through a holding company that I could never get full documentation on, despite requesting it twice through official channels. He paused. "I've been requesting it for 11 years, Vaelor. I stopped because I understood the requests weren't going to be answered, and I made a decision about what that meant. Perhaps I should have made a different decision." The silence in the room was the particular silence of men confronting a pattern they've been choosing, with varying degrees of awareness not to see. General Corvath, who was 45 and ambitious in the specific way of men who calculate loyalty as a function of probability, said carefully, "If the Duchess took sensitive documents..." "She took the Black Ledger," Vaelor said. He said it because he had worked it out in the East Wing doorway, in those 6 minutes, when the specific quality of the room's emptiness had triggered the specific memory of the case he had seen in the dressing room on the 4th day when he had come to retrieve a document Aldrich had misfiled in the household archives, a case that had no business being in a duchess's personal luggage, a case with a lock he had recognized as the Valecrest estate's legal archive seal. He had noted it. He had not asked about it. He had done what he did with most things he didn't fully understand yet. Filed it for later. There was no later now. Hayth's face had gone very still. "If she has the ledger," the old man said quietly, "then she has names." "Yes." "And if she has names, and she's moving, then she's not running," Vaelor said. "She's deploying." He rode out himself. He took 12 men, his best, not the Imperial Guard, not the ceremonial detail, but the 12 men who had ridden with him through the Second Ostaran campaign, and whose loyalty had been tested in conditions that didn't leave room for ambiguity. He told them they were tracking a missing person, which was technically accurate and omitted everything relevant, and they read his face and understood that questions were not part of the assignment. They rode north first, because north was Valecrest, and Valecrest was the only home she had, and people who are frightened or fleeing fall toward the familiar. He expected to find her at the estate or moving toward it, and he had prepared in the early morning hours while Aldrich was compiling names, and the war room was recalibrating itself around a decade's worth of deliberately unconsidered information, the conversation he intended to have with her. He had not prepared for what he found instead. The first village was 3 hours north of the capital, a market town called Aurethia, which he knew because it sat on the primary trade route and had been a logistics point in the eastern supply chain, one of the 3 depots in the disruption report, in fact, which he now viewed with a different quality of attention than he had when he'd first read it. He rode through Aurethia at the 9th hour and found the market square occupied by a crowd that had the specific quality of people who have recently received news and are still processing its implications. He stopped his horse. A broadsheet was being passed from hand to hand. He watched 3 people read it and watched their faces change. He rode to the nearest broadsheet vendor, took one without stopping, and kept moving. He read it on horseback at a canter, which was harder than it sounds. It was dense with figures, banking figures, supply contract figures, names of creditors and debtors, and holding companies, and the specific transaction dates that connected all of them. It was the kind of document that was not interesting to most people, that required a specific literacy and financial structure to decode. And yet it had been written with a deliberate clarity, stripped of jargon, built for comprehension by someone who was not a specialist, someone who had understood that the weapon was only useful if the people who needed to see it could read it. He didn't need to read past the 3rd paragraph to know where this had come from. He kept writing. The second broadsheet was in the village of Korath, 6 miles further, and it covered different material: military contracts, depot allocations, the specific pattern of selective disruption that his counsel had attributed to a logistics coordination failure. The third was in the crossroads town of Marin's Fork, and it had names: imperial names, senate names, the kind of names that don't appear in broadsheets in the ordinary course of Aurethian political life. Because the people those names belong to have spent significant resources ensuring that the distance between their activities and any printed record remains absolute. Someone had closed that distance overnight. He folded the broadsheets and put them in his coat and rode hard. What? She wasn't at the Valecrest estate. He knew it before he arrived because the estate looked operational and undisturbed, which was not the condition of a property whose mistress had just arrived in crisis. The steward who met him at the gate had not seen the Duchess in 4 months, which was before she'd left for the capital. He was an old man named Peric, who had served the Valecrest household for 30 years, and who looked at Vaelor with the specific expression of a man examining something he has already formed a judgment about. "She's not here," Vaelor said. "No, Your Grace," Peric said, when you last spoke with her, before she left for the capital." "She came to the archives," Peric said, with the careful precision of a man who is choosing what to offer voluntarily and what to make them ask for. "Spent 2 days there. Then she left." "What was she looking for in the archives?" The old steward looked at him for a moment. In the look was something that Vaelor recognized, the specific quality of a man who has served a family for 3 decades and has transferred the full weight of that loyalty to the last surviving member of it, and is now deciding what this new figure is owed. "Her father's papers," Peric said finally. "The late Duke kept records of everything, Your Grace. It was one of his more significant qualities." "She found something." "I expect she found what he left for her to find," Peric said. "He was ill for a long time. A man who knows he's dying and has something that needs to be found eventually makes sure it can be found." Vaelor sat on his horse in the autumn light of the Valecrest estate and felt the specific sensation of a man who has been moving through a structure for 11 years without understanding the structure, and has just seen the whole of it from above for the first time. "Where would she go?" he said. "If not here?" Peric considered him. "She has no family left," the old steward said, "but she has something better than family. She has the names of every person in Aurethia who owes the Valecrest estate a debt that was never publicly recorded." He paused. "Her father was a careful man, and the people who were careful to stay close to him were careful for a reason." He found her on the 4th day. Not because he was a better tracker than she had anticipated, but because she let him find her, which he didn't understand until afterward. She was in a coastal town called Verath, which had no strategic importance and no imperial administrative presence, which was the point. A town that existed between jurisdictions, the kind of place that the empire's governance touched lightly, if at all, and where a woman moving with careful purpose and a locked case could spend 3 days working without attracting the specific quality of attention that would bring soldiers. She was in the upper room of a merchant's house near the harbor when his advance rider spotted the Valacrest household flag above the door. Not hidden, not concealed, which was either arrogance or deliberate signal. And Vaelor had the specific sensation, riding through Verath's harbor streets with the salt wind off the gray water, of understanding that he was entering a conversation whose terms had already been set by someone other than him. He went in alone. The room was a working space, not a refuge. Maps on the table, documents in organized stacks. 2 attendants, not the palace attendants, but women he didn't recognize, local women by the look of them, moving with the focused quiet of people executing tasks they understand the weight of. Seraphine was at the table with her back to the door. She did not turn when he entered. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. She turned then, and he looked at her and understood immediately that the 14 days in the palace and the wedding and the feast and the 4 sentences had all been, in some essential sense, a performance staged for an audience he had believed he was directing. The woman at this table was not the composed duchess, not the careful bride. She was something with its full shape visible now, something that had been waiting behind all that necessary surface work, and it was angrier and sharper and far more dangerous than anything he had accounted for. "You read the broadsheets," she said. 3 of them. "There are 11. By tonight there will be 14. By the end of the week, every major trade hub in the empire will have a version calibrated for what their population needs to understand first." He looked at the maps. His military logistics instinct processed the spread pattern before his conscious mind had caught up with it. The deployment had a professional precision to it, a phased release designed to build comprehension rather than overwhelm, moving from financial exposure to military exposure to names in a sequence that was clearly calculated. "You've been planning this for longer than 14 days, he said. "Yes. Since before you came to the capital. Since before I read the ledger," she said. "The ledger confirmed what I already knew existed. My father spent the last 3 years of his life building a map of what had been done and who had done it. He died before he could use it. I spent 6 years after his death determining whether his death was natural." She paused. It wasn't. The room was very quiet except for the harbor sounds below. The water, the birds, the distant work sounds of a functioning port. "Mirel," he said. "Mirel is a component," Seraphine said, and the flat precision of it landed harder than any version of the word with emotion in it would have. "She's the part that interfaces with you because that's where she's most useful. The structure below her involves 8 banking council members, 4 of your generals, 24 senators, and a holding company architecture that has been diverting imperial military supply funding for 11 years. She held his gaze. 11 years, Vaelor. The entire duration of your military ascent. Every war you won was financed by a budget that was simultaneously being systematically stolen. Every supply line disruption that you've been attributing to coordination failures was selective diversion. Your victories are real. What built them was rotten." He said nothing. He was thinking about Haith, about the supply contract request that had been submitted twice and never answered, about Aldrich, who had come from the Banking Council's administrative staff and who had been in his household for 11 years, and who had been, he understood with a cold clarity that arrived without drama, the eyes and ears of something that had been watching him from the inside the entire time. "The note," he said. "You never asked why." "You didn't ask why I was reading trade law," she said. "You didn't ask why I was in the archives for 3 hours on the second day. You didn't ask why I requested the military summary reports, or what I was writing every evening, or why I spent an entire afternoon walking the East Wing checking the exits." She picked up a document from the table and looked at it without reading it. "You decided what I was before I arrived. You decided I was a political arrangement requiring management. And that decision, that specific failure of attention, is the reason I was able to do what I've done in the last 4 days while your military council was still trying to figure out which direction I'd run." His jaw was tight. He could feel it, the physical pressure of swallowed response, and he let it sit there because she was not wrong, and he knew she was not wrong, and he had spent 15 years commanding men specifically by not pretending wrong things were right. "What do you want?" he said. She looked at him. "I want you to understand what you're actually the Duke of," she said, "before they kill you for knowing." The window behind her showed the harbor, the gray water, the ships moving with the slow purpose of vessels that have somewhere to be. He looked at her face and thought about the note, the 4 words with their quality of patience, and thought about Peric at the Valcrest estate, the old man with 30 years of loyalty in his voice saying she found what he left her to find. "Who else knows you're here?" he said. "By now?" She set the document down. "Everyone who read Broadsheet 7, which went to the capital this morning. Broadsheet 7 names. Aldrich," she said, "among others." His breath went out of him, not the breath of surprise, the breath of a man receiving a confirmation he has been building toward and hoped he was wrong about. "He'll move against you," Vaelor said. "The moment he reads it, he'll—" "I know," Seraphine said. "That's why I made sure you found me today and not tomorrow." Something in that landed with a weight he hadn't expected, and he looked at her, really looked at her, with the quality of attention he should have been applying for 14 days, and understood that she had mapped this too, had factored him into the sequence, had left the Valcrest flag visible over the door not because she was careless, but because she needed him in this room before the other side read their name in print and understood that the game had changed. She needed him, and he was here. "Show me the ledger," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, the assessment of a woman who has been moving alone through hostile territory for 4 days and is now deciding, at the point where the decision could not be more consequential, whether to trust the one variable she has never been able to fully calculate. She moved to the locked case on the shelf behind her. She opened it, and Vaelor Draven sat down for the first time since he'd entered the room, and she set the black ledger on the table in front of him, and outside the harbor town of Verath, the gray water moved against the docks with the indifferent persistence of things that do not know or care that the empire they bordered was, as of this moment, at the point from which there was no returning. What neither of them knew was that 30 miles away, on the road between Verath and the capital, a rider in Mirel Voss's colors had already turned back. He had read Broadsheet 7 at a crossroads inn. He was riding hard. He read for 2 hours. Vaelor Draven had read military reports in burning buildings, field dispatches written in dying men's blood, surrender terms drafted by enemies who knew they had already lost and were writing the documents anyway because capitulation requires its paperwork. He had read things that changed what he understood about a battle, about a campaign, about a man he thought he knew. He had believed, going into that harbor room in Verath, that he had a reasonable accounting of what he did not know, and that the ledger would fill specific gaps in a picture he mostly had. He did not have the picture. He had been looking at a wall and calling it a window. The ledger ran to 240 pages in his father's former steward's precise administrative hand, not his father's hand, which told him something immediately, which told him the compilation had been done by someone who worked in proximity to the source and had access to the original documents but was not himself the subject of them. Names, dates, figures, contract references, transaction trails through 3 and 4 layers of holding company architecture. 11 years of systematic extraction from the imperial military budget, which was the visible layer. Beneath that, the banking monopoly arrangements that controlled credit access for 6 of Aurethia's 8 major trade routes, which was the economic layer. Beneath that, the Senate appointments, the judicial positions, the military commands allocated not on merit but on demonstrated willingness to participate in or ignore the extraction, which was the structural layer. And beneath all of that, in the ledger's final 30 pages, written in a different hand, a shaking hand, an ill man's hand, a hand that had decided it was not going to die without making a record, the origin document. The founding arrangement, the specific meeting, 11 years prior, in which a set of men had gathered and decided that the Empire's new military rising star was an extraordinary asset who could be kept useful and controllable if the people around him were carefully curated, if his intelligence channels were managed, if the woman beside him was selected rather than chosen. Seraphine had been watching him read. She had not spoken. She sat at the other end of the table with her hands flat on its surface, and she watched his face with the particular attention of a woman who has been waiting for this specific moment for a very long time and is now experiencing the complex reality of it. That the vindication of a thing you have spent years working toward does not feel the way you imagined it would feel, because reality has a texture that imagination cannot fully replicate. And the texture of this reality included the face of a man she had married and needed and was not yet certain she could trust, coming apart in real time across a table covered in documents that proved his entire ascent had been scaffolded by people who considered him a vehicle. "Aldrich didn't come from the banking council," Vaelor said. His voice was flat, the specific flat of a man who has routed everything through control because the alternative is not acceptable right now. He was placed from the beginning. Yes. He was my father's steward's replacement. My father trusted him. "Your father trusted the recommendation," Seraphine said carefully. "The recommendation came from Senator Borean's office. Borean's name is on page 112. Vaelor turned to page 112. He looked at it for a long time. Borean, who had told him at the feast that his new duchess was sharp. Borean, who had been the first senior senator to back his military command appointments, who had smoothed the path for 3 of his most critical campaigns, who had sat at his right hand at 40 dinners, and whose counsel he had considered among the most reliable in the imperial circle. Borean, whose name appeared in the ledger against a series of banking arrangements that had been drawing from the same supply contract fund for 11 years, regular as a tide. "How many people in the capital have read Broadsheet 7 by now?" Vaelor said. "Not a question about information, a question about time." "By the 9th hour this morning," Seraphine said, "the print run I arranged would have reached the distribution points. The harbor broadsheet sellers, the market traders, 3 of the major inns." She paused. "And Aldrich's contact in the palace courier service, who was on my list for a different reason, but whose morning route takes him past the harbor." Vaelor looked up from the ledger. "You put Aldrich's name in Broadsheet 7, knowing his contact would get it first." "I needed him to move," she said. "I needed him to make a decision under pressure before he had time to manage it correctly. People like Aldrich are extraordinarily dangerous when they have time to think. When they're reacting—" She stopped. "They make the kind of mistakes that confirm what the ledger says." "You used yourself as bait." "I used the information as bait," she said. "There's a difference." He closed the ledger. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling of the merchant's room in Vaerath, which was low-beamed and salt-stained, and he breathed with the deliberate regulation of a man keeping something very large, very controlled. "My generals?" he said. 4 of them, pages 160 through 180. Korvath, page 173. He had trusted Korvath, had trusted him in the field, which was the deepest category of trust a commander developed, the kind that went beyond professional assessment into something that resembled, and he had not thought of it in these terms before, but the word was available now: faith. Korvath had pulled him out of an ambush in the Second Ostaran campaign, had ridden back into fire to do it. That memory had a physical quality to it, a warmth that he now had to hold alongside page 173, and the 2 things existed in him simultaneously like a fracture running through load-bearing stone, and he understood, with the cold animal clarity of a man who has just lost something he cannot get back, that this was what betrayal actually felt like from the inside. Not the dramatic revelation, the quiet structural collapse, the understanding that a thing you built your weight on was never the thing you thought it was. "Your father knew," he said. "My father found out," Seraphine said. "There's a difference there too. He spent 3 years verifying before he started recording. He was a careful man. He was not a political man or a military man. He was an accountant and an estate manager, and he understood numbers. He followed the numbers, and the numbers took him somewhere he didn't want to go, and he spent 3 years hoping he was wrong." She paused. "He wasn't wrong. And then he died. And then he died." The harbor sounds below had taken on a different quality in the silence of the room, more present, more specific, The sounds of ordinary life moving forward with complete indifference to what was happening in this upper room above it. "Who else knows about the ledger itself?" Vaelor said. "Not the broadsheets, the actual document." "Aldrich knows it exists," Seraphine said. "He knew before I left. I made sure he knew." Vaelor looked at her. "You told him." "I let him find out," she said, with the precise distinction of someone for whom the difference between those two things was architecturally significant. "On the 12th day. I left a specific reference visible in my desk correspondence that I knew his network would read and that I knew he would recognize. I needed him to understand that the ledger was real and that I had it, because the moment he understood that, his options collapsed from many to 2. Report to Morel or move against you directly." "He reported," she said. "I expected him to report. What I needed was for the report to go up the full chain, which would take 2 days, which gave me exactly the window I needed to get the first broadsheets placed before anyone at the top of that chain had fully processed what was happening." He sat with that for a moment. This woman had been running a campaign. Inside his palace, inside his household, inside the 14 days he had spent processing her as a peripheral variable, she had been running a campaign with the specific discipline of a field commander who understands that the first resource any operation has is time, and that time is always being spent by someone, and the only question is whether it is being spent by you. He had not been spending it. She had. "The rider in Morel's colors," he said, because the thought had arrived and he needed to say it to see if it was true. "The one who turned back at the crossroads. You saw him." "My advance man saw him, 30 miles north." "Then we have less time than I planned for," she said. Her voice was level, but something shifted in her posture. A fractional adjustment, the body revising its assessment of the tactical situation. "I had a 24-hour window from Broadsheet 7's release. If the rider turned back at the crossroads at..." The door opened. Not with the sound of a person knocking and entering, with the sound of a door that has been unlocked from the outside by someone who has a key and is not especially interested in announcing themselves. The man who came through it was not Aldrich. He was someone Vaelor had never seen before, which meant he was not palace staff and not military, which meant he was something else entirely. Large, quiet, professional in the specific way of men who are paid for a single category of skill. He had 2 others behind him. Seraphine was out of her chair before the door was fully open. Vaelor was on his feet at the same moment, the military reflex bypassing everything else. The 12 men he had brought were outside, which was now obviously a mistake, which he filed and moved past because the time for that assessment was not now. He put himself between Seraphine and the door, which was instinct, which surprised him slightly. "The ledger," the first man said. His voice had no particular quality to it. The voice of a professional. "Gone," Vaelor said. "Duke Draven." The man's tone was not disrespectful. It was the tone of a man who has been briefed on the rank of the person he is dealing with and has decided the briefing is not relevant to the current assignment. "The ledger. And the Duchess. Lady Voss has requested..." "Lady Voss," Vaelor said, "has no authority to request anything of a crown duke." "With respect, Your Grace," Lady Voss anticipated that response. He reached into his coat. He produced a document. He held it up. Vaelor looked at it from across the room. It was an imperial order. He recognized the seal, the specific wax seal of the Imperial Administrative Council, which was the body that held executive authority when the Duke was determined to be... He read the relevant word from across the room. Incapacitated. The document declared him incapacitated. It bore 6 signatures. He recognized 4 of them. The room had a specific quality of silence for the 3 seconds that followed. The silence of a man looking at something that should not exist and processing, with the cold, systematic efficiency of a military mind that has been in bad situations before, exactly how bad this particular situation was. 6 signatures. The Administrative Council had 9 seats. 6 was a supermajority. The document was legally under Aurethian imperial law, which he had never had reason to read carefully because he had never imagined a version of events in which it applied to him. The document was legally sufficient. Seraphine's hand closed around his arm, not a gesture of fear, something more precise. Her fingers found the specific pressure point that communicates not yet without words, and he felt it, and he held. "My men are outside," he said. "Your men are currently speaking with some colleagues of ours," the professional said. "They are unharmed. That is a condition that can change." Vaelor looked at Seraphine. She was looking at the document, and her face had the expression of a woman running calculations at a speed that the circumstances required, and he watched her work through it and watched the moment when she arrived at the answer. And the answer was written in the specific quality of stillness that preceded an acceptance of a bad option when all worse options had been eliminated. "The case," she said quietly. "Give them the case," Vaelor said, at the same moment. The professional's expression did not change. Seraphine went to the shelf. She took down the locked case. She set it on the table. She stepped back. The professional moved forward, opened the case, looked inside, and Vaelor watched his face for the fraction of a second that it registered what it was seeing: the empty interior, the clean velvet lining. And then the professional's face did something it had not done before, which was show something, not shock exactly, a recalibration. "Where is it?" he said. "I don't know what you mean," Seraphine said. "The ledger was in this case." "The case is empty," she said. Vaelor looked at her. He did not know when she had moved it. He had watched her open the case 20 minutes ago. He had watched the ledger come out of it. He had held the ledger for 2 hours. He ran back through the sequence with the specific attention of a man checking his own memory for gaps and found, with a cold shock, the gap. The attendants. The 2 local women who had been moving through the room with the focused quiet of people executing tasks they understood the weight of. One of them had left the room at the 40-minute mark, which he had noted peripherally and not registered as relevant. She had sent the ledger out with the attendant. 40 minutes into his reading. Before he had finished the first section. Before she could have known whether he was going to be an ally or a problem. She had sent the ledger out without knowing which one he was going to be, because she had understood that the ledger could not be in this room if this room became the room it had now become, and she had moved it on a timeline that assumed the worst and planned around it. He felt something shift in his chest. Not admiration exactly. Something harder than admiration and more specific. "Search the room," the professional said. They searched the room. The ledger was not in the room. What happened next happened in the space of 4 seconds and covered a great deal of ground. The professional made the decision that the original assignment had a secondary component that was now primary, which was that the Duchess and the Duke needed to be removed from Verath regardless of the ledger's current location, because a ledger without its owner was a document without a witness, and Morel Voss had not survived 11 years of operating at this level by leaving witnesses in play. He reached for Seraphine. Vaelor broke 2 of his fingers. He did it with the clinical efficiency of a man for whom physical confrontation is a technical skill rather than an emotional experience, the way a surgeon cuts. And the professional made a sound, and Vaelor had his body between Seraphine and the other 2 men, and the calculation had changed because it is different to stand between armed professionals and a woman you are willing to let them take, and different entirely to stand between them and someone you are not. He was not. He could not have said precisely when that decision had been made. The window was behind them, harborside, 2nd floor. He looked at Seraphine and she looked at the window, and they had, in that moment, the specific communication of 2 people who have just arrived at the same conclusion through different routes. They went through the window. The fall was 12 feet onto a fish merchant's canopy, which absorbed enough of it to make the rest survivable, and then they were on the harbor stones and running, and behind them the room above had erupted with the sounds of men in motion, and ahead of them the gray harbor of Verath offered exactly one relevant piece of information, which was that the tide was out, and the fishing boats in the near dock were unguarded, and one of them had its lines already loosened. Vaelor's 12 men were compromised, incapacitated. He did not know. He filed it, he kept moving. Seraphine was running ahead of him, and she was faster than he had expected, which he also filed. And they hit the dock boards at a sprint, and she went for the nearest boat with the directness of a woman who had already thought about this contingency, which she had, because she thought about all the contingencies, and he understood in the cold salt air of the Verath harbor with pursuit 30 seconds behind them, that this was what it meant to operate beside someone who plans 3 moves ahead of the current position. His empire had just declared him incapacitated. His steward had been a placed agent for 11 years. 4 of his generals were in the ledger. Morel had assigned administrative order and professional assets in the field. And the woman who had been delivered to him as a political ornament was standing in a stolen fishing boat with the ledger's location in her head and the harbor wind in her face, and her hand extended toward him with the specific quality of someone who is not asking a question but is waiting for an answer. He took her hand and got in the boat. Behind them, on the dock, the first of the pursuers had reached the end of the boards. Ahead, the gray water opened toward the coastal fortress that Seraphine had marked on her maps 3 days ago. In the window of the merchant's room, with the same methodical patience she brought to everything she did. She had planned for this too. He rowed. The coastal fortress had no name anyone still used. It appeared on old military maps as Verath Point Garrison, which was what it had been 200 years prior when the Empire's southern coast needed defending against naval raids that no longer came. What remained was stone. A lot of it. The specific kind of stone that coastal weather works on for 2 centuries and produces something that looks less like architecture and more like geology, gray and salt-stripped and brutal in the particular way of things that have outlasted every human purpose they were built for. 3 towers, the northern one partially collapsed. Walls that had been 12 feet thick and were now, in sections, 8, where the sea had taken its portion. A courtyard that the wind moved through like it owned the place. Seraphine had marked it on her map for one reason. It sat on a promontory accessible from the water on 2 sides and from the land on one, and the land approach was a single switchback road that a man could hold against 20 if he understood terrain. She had understood terrain since she was 12 and managing 40,000 acres of it. They pulled the boat onto the shingle beach on the fortress's eastern side as the sun was dropping toward the water, the light going the color of old copper, and Vaelor shipped the oars and looked at the walls above them and said nothing for a moment, which was the specific nothing of a man doing rapid tactical assessment. "How many people know about this location?" he said. "The attendant who took the ledger is meeting us here at nightfall. No one else." "The ledger is coming here." "The ledger was always coming here," she said. "I needed a place where I could control the approach, where I could see what was coming before it arrived." She pulled the boat higher on the shingle, which she did without asking for help, and he watched her do it and then took the stern and pulled alongside her. "I needed somewhere that Morel's assets couldn't surround without showing themselves on open ground first." "She has more than 3 men," he said. "She has considerably more than 3 men." Seraphine looked up at the fortress walls. "But she has a problem, which is that she needs the ledger intact, and she needs the people who know what's in it either controlled or eliminated, and those 2 requirements are in tension with each other. The more force she brings to this location, the more she confirms publicly what the broadsheets are implying. She can't bring an army to a coastal ruin without someone asking why." "She brought enough to get an imperial administrative order signed by 6 council members in less than 48 hours, Vaelor said. "That's not a small operation." "No," Seraphine said. "It's not." They climbed the path to the fortress in the copper evening light, and the wind off the water was cold enough to cut through a coat, and neither of them spoke because they were both thinking too hard for conversation to be useful. Inside the fortress walls, the wind dropped to something manageable, and the courtyard held the last of the day's warmth in its stones. Vaelor moved through the interior with the systematic efficiency of a man who cannot enter a space without immediately understanding it as a tactical problem. Exits, sight lines, structural integrity, the specific ways in which a position could be defended, and the specific ways in which it could fail. The northern tower was out. The eastern wall had a section that had lost enough mass to be a weakness. The gatehouse was the choke point. He came back to the courtyard where Seraphine was sitting on a broken section of wall with the slim ledger volume open in her hands. Not the black ledger, which was still with the attendant, but her own Valicrest shorthand record, the slim volume he had seen locked in the drawer. And she was writing. "Still taking notes," he said. "Always," she said, without looking up. He sat on the wall opposite her and watched the light go. The sea was visible through a gap in the eastern wall, gray-green and running hard, the kind of sea that doesn't perform for observers. He thought about Corvath, whose name was on page 173, and who had pulled him out of an ambush in a war that he now understood had been financed by the same people who had been stealing from it. He thought about the 12 men he had brought to Verath and left outside a merchant's house, and he did not know where those men were now or what condition they were in, and that not knowing had a weight to it that sat specifically in the chest. He thought about the administrative order, 6 signatures, a supermajority. "Walk me through what happens if Morel gets the ledger," he said. Seraphine looked up. "She destroys it. The broadsheets are already out, so the names are public, but broadsheets without documentary evidence are allegations. Allegations against people of that rank require more than a printed page. Without the ledger, every named party has the same defense: fabrication, political attack, the desperate maneuver of a disgraced duchess who fled her husband's household in shame." She held his gaze. "They'll make it about me. The story becomes a bitter woman with a forged document. Without the original record, I cannot prove otherwise. And with it, the transaction records are verifiable. The signatures are real. The financial trails lead to accounts that exist and can be audited. The ledger isn't a record of allegations. It's a record of events. Dates, figures, counterparty names. The kind of evidence that doesn't require anyone to believe a woman's account, because the numbers speak independently of her." He looked at the sea through the wall's gap. "My father," he said. Not a full sentence, the beginning of one. "Your father was not in the ledger," she said. "I want you to be clear on that." Something in his shoulders shifted. "He built the military structure that they used," she said, "but I don't believe he understood what was happening inside it. The arrangement was constructed specifically to operate in the spaces his attention didn't reach. They needed his legitimacy. They didn't need his awareness." She paused. If they had needed his awareness, he would have been in the ledger. Vaelor was quiet for a moment. "And me? You're not in the ledger either. That's not what I'm asking." She looked at him directly. The evening light had gone blue-gray, and it gave everything a flattened quality, a kind of visual honesty that hid nothing. "You were the mechanism," she said. "The military victories were real. The political authority you accumulated was real. They needed you to be exactly what you are: competent, successful, genuinely formidable, because a false front collapses, and they needed something that held weight. What they built around you was invisible specifically because what you were doing was real." She closed the slim volume. "You weren't complicit. You were curated." He had no response to that. He sat with it, the way he had sat with page 173, the way a load-bearing fracture is sat with, not because there is anything to be done about it immediately, but because it needs to be fully understood before the next move. "The attendant," he said. "When?" "After dark. She knows this location. And after she arrives." "I send the ledger north," Seraphine said, "to Lord Commander Hayth, who is not in the ledger and who has been requesting those supply contract documents for 11 years. I have a letter for him already written. The ledger and the letter together are sufficient for him to convene an emergency military tribunal without requiring Senate approval." She paused. "Hayth has the authority. I believe he has the will. The question is whether we're alive to confirm the ledger's authenticity in person." Vaelor looked at her. "You plan for the possibility that you wouldn't be," he said. "I plan for all the possibilities," she said quietly. The fortress was very still around them. The wind had dropped with the dark. Somewhere below, the sea was working at the base of the promontory with the impersonal persistence of water against stone, the sound of something that has infinite patience and does not lose. He thought, she had spent 22 years learning to be the thing that does not lose. He thought, he had spent 15 years winning wars while the people who benefited from those wars had been studying every possible angle of him for anything exploitable. He thought, the woman sitting 4 feet from him on a broken fortress wall in the dark with her shorthand ledger and her coastal maps had looked at the same corrupt system he had been moving through his entire adult life, and had decided with the specific clarity of someone who has no institutional backing and no military resources and no allies except the ones she built herself, to destroy it from the outside. He said, "I should have asked why." She looked at him. "On the wedding night," he said, You said you came in good faith. I didn't ask why a woman who clearly was not surprised by anything I did came to that table in good faith. Would you have believed the answer? No, he said. Probably not. Then the timing is right, she said. Not forgiving exactly. Something more practical than forgiveness. The acknowledgement that a variable has been correctly identified and can now be incorporated into the calculation. The sound came from the southern wall. Not loud. Exactly the sound that a man makes when he is trying to make no sound and has misjudged the acoustics of a stone courtyard. Vaelor was on his feet before the sound had finished registering, with the reflex of a man whose 15 years of field experience are stored not in his mind but in his body. And Seraphine was behind him, and they were both moving toward the gatehouse when the second sound came, from the northern approach this time, which meant the gatehouse was already compromised, which meant they had come in on two vectors simultaneously, which meant someone had done their own reconnaissance of this location and had not come to negotiate. 4 men over the southern wall. Vaelor counted them by sound before he saw them, by the specific way multiple bodies cross a stone surface in the dark. And he met the first one at the courtyard's edge with 15 years of combat experience distilled into something that did not resemble anything practiced or formal, something that was just damage delivered as efficiently as possible. The man went down. The second one came in fast, and Vaelor took the impact and converted it, used the man's own momentum and the wall's solidity, and the sound that followed was the sound of a skull meeting stone, and then silence. The third man had a blade. Vaelor took the cut across his left forearm, which he registered as information rather than pain at this particular moment, and got inside the man's reach and finished it, and the fourth had pulled back to reassess the situation, which was the intelligent response, except that Seraphine had moved along the wall in the dark and had found the loose half-brick that had been sitting at the base of the eastern wall, and she put it across the fourth man's temple with a directness that Vaelor would think about later, in quieter conditions with a specific quality of respect. From the gatehouse, 3 more. He was bleeding. The forearm was bleeding more than the initial assessment had suggested, the specific bleeding of a cut that had found something worth finding, and he could feel it in the grip of his left hand now. Not incapacitating, not yet, but the kind of loss that has a timeline attached to it if nothing is done. He did not mention it. The 3 from the gatehouse had the quality of men who had seen the first 4 handled and had recalibrated their approach, which meant they were professionals and not simply hired for numbers. They came in with the spread pattern of people who have trained together, and Vaelor understood in the 2 seconds he had to understand it that he could handle 2 of them in the condition he was in, and the third was a problem. Seraphine solved the third one. She had found something else in the dark. A length of chain, old, the kind of chain that got left in coastal fortresses when the equipment it once secured had rotted away, and she used it with a savagery that had nothing of elegance in it and everything of absolute commitment. The way a person fights when fighting is the only available option, and they have long since resolved their relationship with what that requires. The courtyard went still. Vaelor stood in the dark with 7 men on the ground around him, and his left arm bleeding and his breathing harder than he preferred, and he looked at Seraphine. She was against the wall. She was breathing hard too. In the low light, he could see the chain still in her hands and the specific expression on her face. Not fear, not relief. Something between the two that the body makes when it has been running at extreme output and the immediate requirement has just stopped. He crossed to her in 4 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her with the specific attention of a man checking for damage, the way you check a thing that matters, and she let him look. And then she said, "Your arm. It's fine. It's not fine. It's fine enough." He released her. He looked at the gatehouse. "There are more coming." "I know." "The attendant, she has a different route. She won't come through the gatehouse." Seraphine pushed off the wall. She was steady on her feet, which he noted. "There's a water gate on the north side. She knows it." "How long?" "An hour, maybe less." She looked at his arm. "Sit down." "Seraphine, sit down," she said with the tone of someone who has decided that this particular argument is not going to happen. And she found her pack where she had dropped it in the opening movement, and she tore a strip from something inside it and came back and tied off his arm with the specific competent efficiency of a woman who had been managing a large estate and all its attendant accidents and emergencies for over a decade, and knew what to do about a cut that had found something worth finding. He let her. Her hands were steady, completely steady. He watched them work and thought about the 4 words she had left on his desk in a handwriting so controlled it looked carved. And he thought about page 173, and he thought about Peric at the Valicrest gate saying she found what he left her to find, and he thought about the man on the dock in Verath who had produced a document bearing 6 of his council's signatures and declared him incapacitated. When we get the ledger to Haith, he said, and the tribunal convenes, what happens to the Senate? A significant portion of it is going to prison, she said, tying off the strip. The rest are going to spend the next year trying to establish that they knew nothing, which some of them actually didn't, and distinguishing between the genuinely uninvolved and the strategically ignorant is going to be the most important and most difficult legal work Aurethia has attempted in 2 generations. And the banking monopolies. Broken up. The holding company structures audited and dissolved. The assets redirected to the supply chains they were stolen from. She sat back on her heels and looked at his arm and then looked at him. It's going to be ugly. The transition is going to be genuinely dangerous. There are going to be factions who would rather start a civil conflict than accept accountability, and those factions currently have military resources. 4 of my generals. At minimum. He looked at the gatehouse. The dark beyond it was still. Not the still of nothing there. The still of people who are waiting, who have not committed to their next move, who are doing their own assessment of the situation and what it costs. Morel is here, he said. He said it because he knew it. Not from evidence exactly, from the quality of the operation, the administrative order, the 2-vector approach, the professionals rather than imperial guards. This was not a delegated action. This was personal management of a problem that had become acute, which was how Morel operated at the moments when delegation was no longer sufficient. Seraphine looked at the gatehouse. Yes, she said, she won't leave without the ledger. No. And she won't leave us here as a loose thread. No. Seraphine stood. She was looking at the gatehouse with the expression of someone who has arrived at the end of a sequence they have been running for a very long time and is taking one moment, one specific, bounded moment, to understand exactly where they are before moving forward. She's been building this for 11 years. The ledger is the only thing that ends it. She needs it destroyed, and she needs the people who've read it. The gate moved, not forced, opened. The specific difference between a gate being broken down and a gate being opened by someone who has the mechanism, which meant someone with prior knowledge of this location and its entry points, which meant the reconnaissance had been thorough, which meant whoever was running this operation had invested real resources in understanding the ground before committing to it. The woman who came through the gate had 4 men behind her and a lantern in her hand, and she held it up and looked at the courtyard and at the 7 men on the ground and at Vaelor and Seraphine standing in the middle of it, and her face in the lantern light was exactly the face it always was, composed, calibrated, the face of a woman who has walked into rooms that were supposed to intimidate her for 11 years and has long since ceased to be intimidated by rooms. Morel Voss looked at Vaelor Draven across the ruined courtyard of a nameless fortress and said, with the specific quality of a woman delivering information she has been looking forward to delivering, there's nowhere left to go. Vaelor looked at her. He thought about page 173 and Senator Borean and Aldrich in his ground floor office with 11 years of placed loyalty behind his eyes, and the administrative order with 6 signatures, and the empire he had built his weight on which had been built, in turn, on something he had never been allowed to see. He thought about his left arm, which was tied off and functional, and was going to need actual attention in some finite period of time. He thought about the attendant who was coming through the water gate on the north side with the black ledger in a sealed case, who was somewhere in the dark right now, moving on a route that Morel's people might or might not have covered. He thought about the thing that had shifted in the east wing doorway when he stood there for 6 minutes reading a room that was so empty it had the quality of insult, and the thing that had shifted further on a shingle beach in copper evening light, and further still in a dark courtyard when he had taken a woman's face in his hands and looked for damage with the attention of a man checking something that matters. He said nothing. He looked at Morel, and Morel looked at him, and in the space between them, 11 years of constructed proximity and managed intelligence and deliberate cultivation had arrived at this courtyard and was looking at its own reflection without the buffer of architecture or ceremony or the social contracts that had kept it functional and livable. Seraphine's hand found his, not the gesture of a woman seeking protection, the grip of a soldier on the line, the grip that says, "I see what you see and I'm still here." He closed his fingers around hers. 4 words, he said. Morel tilted her head, a fraction. "On the desk," he said, "on the wedding night." He held Morel's gaze with the flat, unwavering attention of a man who has decided something and is in the process of executing it. "You never asked why." He paused. "I'm asking now." Behind Morel, her 4 men were spreading into the courtyard. Behind Vaelor, the dark held whatever it held. The lantern light moved in the sea wind, and from the north side of the fortress, from the direction of the water gate, came a sound, very small, very specific. The sound of a latch handled by someone who knows how to handle it quietly. Morel heard it. Her eyes moved, a fraction, involuntary, the specific reflex of a woman who has spent 11 years managing every variable and has just heard one she did not account for. Vaelor watched her hear it, and in that fraction, in the specific instant when Morel Voss's attention moved from him to the sound at the water gate, he understood that the attendant had made it, that the ledger was inside the walls, that the one variable Morel had not fully controlled was now in the same courtyard as the woman who needed to destroy it, and that what happened in the next 60 seconds was going to determine whether Aurethia was the empire it was or the empire it could be made into. He looked at Seraphine. She was already moving. Seraphine moved toward the water gate. Morel moved to stop her. That was the geometry of the next 4 seconds. Morel's attention splitting between the sound at the water gate and the woman crossing the courtyard toward it, the 4 men behind her recalibrating their spread, and Vaelor understanding with the cold clarity of a man who has spent 15 years reading battlefield geometry that the choke point was not the gate. The choke point was Morel herself. Everything that had been built and sustained and protected for 11 years ran through one woman's understanding of who knew what and what could be done about it. And that woman was now standing in a lantern-lit courtyard with her attention divided for the first time. He crossed the courtyard in 6 strides, not toward Morel's men, toward Morel. She turned when she heard him coming, which was fast, which was the reflex of a woman who had survived 11 years in proximity to power by never fully relaxing her awareness. And she brought the lantern up and said something sharp to the nearest man, and he moved to intercept, and Vaelor went through him the way water goes through a gap. Not around, not over, through. And the man went down and Vaelor was inside Morel's reach, and she looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who has run every scenario and has now encountered the one she waited least. "Vaelor, don't," he said. He took the lantern from her hand. Not violently, with the specific quality of a man removing a tool from someone who no longer has any use for it. She let it go because the alternative required a physical response, and she was not, whatever else she was, a woman who fought with her hands. Behind him, Seraphine had reached the water gate. The attendant came through, young, dark-haired, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who has been carrying something important through hostile dark and has just arrived at the place where she was supposed to arrive. She had the case. She handed it to Seraphine without words because the instructions had been given 3 days ago and the instructions had been followed, and then she stepped back against the wall and made herself small in the way of people who understand that the next few minutes do not belong to them. Morel's 3 remaining men were standing in the courtyard, not advancing. They were reading the room with the professional assessment of people who are calculating whether the assignment has changed, and the assignment had clearly changed, and what professional men do when assignments change, in ways that exceed the original terms, is stop moving and wait for clarity. "Tell them to go," Vaelor said. Morel looked at him. The lantern light between them made her face very clear. Every calculation, every consideration, the specific expression of a woman arriving at a position she has never occupied before, which was the position of having run out of moves. "And then what?" she said. Her voice was level. 11 years of practiced composure, still operational even here. And then we talk. There's nothing to talk about. There's everything to talk about, he said. Or there's nothing, and I handle the next 60 seconds the same way I handled the last 30, and the difference in outcome is significant. He held her gaze. Your choice. Same as it's always been. Something moved across her face. Not fear exactly. Something more complex than fear. The recognition, arriving in real time, that the architecture of the last 11 years had been built on a specific understanding of who Vaelor Draven was, and that understanding was in the process of being revised in ways she had not planned for, and the revision was not in her favor. She said something quiet to her men. They left through the gatehouse. The courtyard was still. Beaumarchais. Seraphine set the case on the section of broken wall and opened it and looked at the black ledger in the lantern light with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something for a long time and is now, finally, in the place where it can be put down. She did not open it. She had no need to open it. Every page of it existed in her with a completeness that no external document could improve on, because she had read it with the specific attention of someone who understood that this was the most important thing she would ever read, and that understanding had been correct. She looked at Morel. Morel was looking at the case. It goes to Lord Commander Hayth tonight, Seraphine said. The letter is already written. The courier is already arranged. By tomorrow morning, every supply contract, every banking arrangement, every name on every page will be in the hands of a man who has been trying to reach them for 11 years and who now has both the authority and the evidence to act. She paused. That's what happens regardless of what happens here. I need you to understand that clearly. Morel looked at her. The expression on her face was not the expression she wore at court, or at the feast, or in the central aisle of the grand hall. That expression had been a performance, calibrated and deployed with professional precision. What was on her face now was something underneath that performance, something that had been there a long time without being allowed to surface. And it was more complicated and more human than anything she had shown in 11 years of carefully managed proximity to power. You think this ends it, Morel said. I think this begins ending it, Seraphine said. The ending takes longer. It's messier. There are people whose names are in that ledger who will spend the next 2 years fighting every step of the legal process with every resource they have left. Some of them have enough resources left to make that fight genuinely dangerous. She held Morel's gaze. But the ledger reaches Hayth tonight. That part is done. Morel looked at Vaelor. And you, she said. After everything, you're standing beside her. Vaelor looked at Morel for a long moment. He was thinking about 11 years. He was thinking about what it meant to have been curated, to have been the genuine article used to authenticate something false, to have been the weight that gave the structure credibility it could not have generated on its own. He was thinking about what Seraphine had said in the harbor room. You weren't complicit. You were curated. He had sat with those words for hours now, and they had not become easier, but they had become clearer, and there was a specific value in clarity that he had always understood, even when what the clarity revealed was not what he wanted to see. You knew me before I was anything, he said to Morel. You were there at the beginning. When I was 23 and I had one successful campaign and nothing else, you were the first person in the capital who treated me like I was already what I was going to become. He paused. I never asked why. Something in Morel's face shifted. That's a habit of yours, she said quietly. It was, he said. I'm working on it. The sea wind moved through the gap in the eastern wall. The lantern flame bent and steadied. Walk away, he said. Not from the consequences. Those belong to the tribunal and I won't interfere with them. But walk away from this courtyard tonight and walk away from whatever was going to happen here. And let what comes next come through the legal process instead of through this. He looked at her with the flat directness that was the only mode he had. There's a version of the next year that ends with you in front of Hayth's tribunal and a version that ends here, and those are your options, and I'm telling you clearly which one I prefer. Morel looked at him for a long time. She looked at Seraphine. She looked at the case on the wall with the black ledger in it. Then she looked at the gatehouse, which was the direction her men had gone, and she walked toward it with the specific quality of a woman who has made a calculation and is executing it, No performance left, just the movement of a person through space toward whatever comes next. And she went through the gate, and the dark outside took her, and the courtyard held the three of them. Vaelor, Seraphine, the attendant against the wall, in a silence that had the specific quality of aftermath. Seraphine let out a breath. Vaelor watched the gatehouse for 30 seconds, because 30 seconds was his professional minimum for believing a thing was done when the thing was Morel Voss. Then he looked at Seraphine and said, "Your arm." She looked down. She had taken a cut at some point during the courtyard fight that she had not mentioned because she had been operating on the same principle he had been operating on, which was that information about damage is processed after the situation requiring the damage has resolved. It was not serious. It was the kind of thing that needed attention and would receive it. "We match," she said. He looked at his own tied-off forearm. "We do," he said. Something almost like a sound that was almost like a laugh moved through the space between them, and neither of them fully committed to it, but it was there, and it had a quality to it that was different from anything that had moved between them in the courtyard or the harbor room or the 14 days in the palace, which was the quality of two people who have been through something together and have arrived at the other side of it still standing. He crossed to her and looked at the cut on her arm, and she let him look, the same way she had let him look at her face in the dark after the fight, with the specific willingness of someone who has decided that being seen is not the same as being vulnerable. "The courier," he said. "She goes in an hour," Seraphine said. She looked at the attendant. "Rest. An hour." The attendant nodded and found a corner of the courtyard that was sheltered from the wind and sat down with the immediate practicality of someone young and tired who does not need to be told twice. They sat on the broken wall, and the sea made its sounds below, and the night settled around the fortress with the impersonal completeness of nights that do not know or care what has happened inside the walls they're covering. "When Hythe convenes the tribunal," Vaelor said, "it will take 3 weeks to assemble, maybe 4. He'll need to be careful about which military units he uses. The 4 generals in the ledger have command over approximately a third of the imperial standing forces, and they will not go quietly." She had her slim volume out, the Valcrest shorthand, and she was writing again, which he had stopped being surprised by. "The banking monopoly dissolution is the harder problem, actually. You can remove corrupt people from positions. Dismantling financial architecture that has been load-bearing for a decade without collapsing the trade routes it's been exploiting requires someone who understands both the legal structure and the financial mechanics simultaneously. You," he said. She looked up. "I'm not making an assumption," he said. "I'm asking." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Me." "Good." She went back to writing. He sat beside her and watched the gap in the eastern wall where the sea was visible, dark and running, and he thought about the man he had been 3 weeks ago. The man who had stood at a cathedral altar with the flat gaze of someone processing a political variable and had not asked a single question worth asking. The man who had delivered 4 sentences in 14 days and considered that sufficient engagement with another human being's existence. The man who had looked at a note that said "you never asked why" and had stood for 6 minutes in a doorway confronting the specific shape of what he had failed to understand. He had spent 15 years becoming something formidable. He had done it by compressing everything that was not tactically relevant, by routing every uncertain thing through the discipline of control, by building a version of himself that won consistently and asking no questions about what winning was for. It had worked. By every measurable standard available to the Aurethian Empire, it had worked. And the thing he was sitting with now, in the salt dark of a ruined fortress with a cut on his forearm, and 7 men somewhere in the courtyard still, and an empire that had declared him incapacitated by a 6-signature document, was the specific understanding that winning and being right about what you were doing were not the same thing, and he had spent 15 years conflating them. He did not say any of this out loud. He sat with it, the way all the difficult things had to be sat with, because the only alternative was to not sit with it, and that had been his operating mode for 15 years, and it had produced page 173, an Aldrich and 6 signatures on a document declaring him incapacitated, and a wedding night where he had delivered 4 sentences to a woman he was now going to spend the rest of his life trying to understand. "Seraphine," he said. She looked up. The wedding, he said. The feast. What I allowed. He looked at the sea through the wall. I'm not going to perform an apology at you. I don't think that's what you need, and I don't think it's what I owe you. What I owe you is something harder than that. She waited. I owe you the actual thing, he said, which is that I looked at you and decided what you were and I was wrong, and being wrong about that cost you something I can't calculate. And I'm not going to tell you that the next year of tribunals and banking dissolution and managing 4 generals who are going to fight every step of it is going to be easier than the 14 days that preceded it. It's not. He looked at her directly. What I'm telling you is that I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. Whatever comes next, I'm asking. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. The night was very still around them. That's a large commitment for a man who spent 15 years not asking anything, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She held his gaze. Then ask something now, she said. He thought for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking, with the specific quality of a man who is learning to be careful about this particular action because he understands now that the question you ask determines the quality of the world you end up inhabiting. What did your father know about you, he said, when he hid the ledger where you'd find it? What did he know you'd do with it? Something moved across her face, deep, slow, the movement of something that has been held still for a long time. He knew I'd finish it, she said. Her voice was quiet. Not fragile. She did not do fragile. But real, which was the thing that cost more. He spent 3 years building that record, and he died before he could use it, and he knew that He knew who I was. He taught me to be who I am. The accounting, the records, the way you follow numbers until they tell you the truth, even when the truth is something you don't want. She paused. He left it where I'd find it because he trusted me to know what to do when I did. Did you know what to do? Not immediately, she said. I sat on it for 6 weeks and I was not calm about it. Whatever I looked like from the outside, I was not calm about it. I was 22 years old and I had a document that could bring down half the imperial senate, and I was being sent in a carriage to marry a man I'd never spoken to, and I had to make a decision about whether the carriage ride was an ending or a beginning. She looked at the sea through the gap in the wall. I decided it was a beginning, and I prepared accordingly. You were never running, he said. Not a question. The final confirmation of something he'd understood in pieces and was now seeing whole. No, she said. I was never running. He sat with that. The hour passed slowly, the way hours pass when there is nothing to do but wait, and the waiting is full of everything that has been done and everything that remains. The attendant slept in her sheltered corner. The sea worked at the base of the promontory. The night moved overhead with the impersonal pace of things on larger timescales than human trouble. At the hour's end, Seraphine sealed the letter she had written and placed it with the black ledger in the case, and locked it and handed it to the attendant, who woke without complaint and received it with both hands and held it with the specific gravity of someone who understands what they are carrying. Seraphine gave her the route, a road that went north and west, away from the capital's direct approaches, through 2 of the Valecrest estate's former tenant villages where faces were known and friendly and the imperial courier network did not reach. She gave her a second letter, sealed separately, with instructions for if the first route became impassable. She gave her no third option. There is no third option, she said, not unkindly, to the attendant's unasked question. If the first 2 routes are both impassable, come back here and we'll find another way. But they won't be. Morel's network is good at the capital and the major roads. The Valecrest back routes are mine. The attendant left through the water gate. The sound of her footsteps faded, and then the night was quiet. They left the fortress at the 2nd hour before dawn, which was the coldest hour, the hour when darkness has fully committed before the light starts its long reclamation. The shingle beach was empty. The boat was where they had left it. Vaelor pulled it into the water, and they got in and he rowed north along the coastline, staying close to the cliffs, in the specific darkness of a sea that is not rough but is not gentle either, a sea that requires attention. Seraphine sat at the bow and watched the water ahead and said nothing for a long time. What she was thinking, in the specific quality of silence she allowed herself now that the fortress was behind them and the ledger was moving north and the next phase was in Haith's hands, was about cost. She had been thinking about the ledger for 6 years in terms of what it would do, what it would expose, what it would dismantle, what it would make possible. She had not thought as carefully about what it would cost, because thinking about cost before you have done the thing is a way of talking yourself out of doing it, and she had not been able to afford that particular luxury. The cost was real. She could feel it now, in the specific way you feel things that you have been holding in suspension during the period when they cannot be allowed to surface. Her father had died knowing what he knew. She had spent 6 years carrying what he had left her. She had spent 14 days in a palace performing the specific exhausting work of being carefully invisible while being completely visible, and she had done it without anyone to tell about it, without anyone who knew the weight of what she was carrying, and the aloneness of that had a shape to it that she was only now, in the second hour before dawn on a dark sea in a boat rowed by a man who had asked the right question, allowing herself to register. She had finished her father's work. She did not know yet exactly how to carry that. She knew she would figure it out because figuring things out was what she did, because her father had taught her that the numbers always told the truth if you followed them far enough, and she had applied that principle to everything, including this. But the figuring out was ahead of her, and what was here, right now, in this boat on this water, was the simple fact of it. She had finished it. Vaelor rowed without speaking, and she did not ask him to because he was giving her the silence, and she recognized the gift for what it was, which was a man learning in real time how to be present for another person without converting that presence into something he could manage or control or deliver in 4 sentences. She would think about that later. The specific, small, extraordinary nature of a man deciding to change. It was not a small thing. Flaunted. They reached the town of Havre's Point as the sky was going gray-blue, that particular pre-dawn blue that looks like the world before the world has committed to being itself. The town had a tavern with rooms and a stable and a keeper who was awake because keepers of harbor taverns are always awake at the second hour before dawn, which is when fishermen and sailors and people who have been on dark water all night come in needing something hot and somewhere to sit. He looked at them with the specific non-judgment of a man who has seen everything come through his door and has learned that asking questions is a less efficient use of time than simply providing what is needed. Vaelor put a coin on the counter. 2 rooms, hot water if you have it. I have it, the keeper said. The rooms were small and low-ceilinged and smelled of salt and old wood, and were the most functional spaces either of them had occupied in weeks. Vaelor looked at his forearm in the lamplight of his room, unwound Seraphine's field dressing, and examined the cut with the professional dispassion of a man who has done this kind of assessment many times. It needed real attention. It would receive it. He rebandaged it with the material the keeper had provided and sat on the edge of the bed and for a moment did nothing but breathe. This was unusual for him. He sat with the unusual nature of it and let it be unusual. There was a knock on the connecting door. Not a real connecting door, just the wall between the 2 rooms with a gap beneath it, but the knock had a specific quality, 3 even beats that communicated identity without words. "Come in," he said, and then, because there was no door to come in through, "The wall is between us." "I know," her voice came back. "I just wanted to know you were there." He sat with that. "I'm here," he said. A pause. "Your arm," she said. "How is it?" "Fine enough," he said. "Yours?" "Fine enough," she said. Another pause. The gray light was growing at the window, the slow, absolute advance of a dawn that was coming whether or not it was wanted. "Haith will have the ledger by evening," she said. "Yes." "The tribunal will take 3 weeks." "You said 4. 3 or 4. "Then we have time," he said. A longer pause. "For what?" she said. "To do what we didn't do," he said. "At the start, the talking, the asking." He looked at the gray window. "You spent 22 years figuring out who to be in conditions that did not make it easy. I'd like to know about it. I'd like to know about your father and the estate and what it cost to sit on that ledger for 6 years and come south anyway. He paused. If you're willing to say it. The silence from the other side of the wall had a different quality from the previous silences. Warmer, more uncertain, which in this particular case was its own kind of warmth. That's a lot of asking, she said. I'm catching up, he said. The dawn came in through the window and made the room gray and gold, and outside the harbor town of Havre's Point was beginning its morning. The sounds of ordinary life recommitting to itself after the night. The specific sounds of a world that does not know and does not need to know that something has shifted in the invisible architecture of the empire it belongs to. That a case with a lock is moving north through Valacrest back roads. That a woman and a man are sitting on either side of a thin wall, learning, with the specific difficulty and specific value of all things worth learning, how to be honest with each other. The empire that Aurethia was going to become was not built in the cathedral, or the grand hall, or the harbor room in Verath, or the ruined fortress on the coast. It was being built here, in the gray-gold morning of a small room above a harbor tavern, in the specific unglamorous work of two people deciding to understand each other. It would be ugly the next year. It would require things from both of them that neither had yet been asked to give. The tribunals would be long. The banking dissolution would be fought at every step. There would be nights that did not have this quality of earned stillness, nights that had the other quality, the quality of crisis and cost, and the ongoing work of a thing that is not finished. But this morning existed. This gray-gold morning in which a woman who had spent 22 years finishing her father's work was on the other side of a wall from a man who had spent 15 years winning the wrong way and was learning to ask, and both of them were alive and the ledger was moving north. It was enough. I'll start at the beginning, Seraphine said. Good, Vaelor said, and in the growing light she did. 1 year later, in the Cathedral of Aurethia, where 600 seats were filled with the rebuilt court of a rebuilt empire, Vaelor Draven stood at the same altar where he had stood before and looked at his wife as she walked toward him, and this time he offered his hand before she reached him. She took it. The ceremony was brief, not because brevity was required, but because everything that needed to be said between them had been said in the months that followed Havre's Point, in the long, unglamorous work of tribunals and dismantled monopolies and 4 generals who fought every step and were defeated at every step, and what remained did not require elaborate staging. What remained was real. When it was done, he placed in her hands not a seal ring but the imperial crown of the Eastern administration, a thing that had no precedent in Aurethian history, a duchess with equal executive authority, which Senator Borean's replacement had argued against for 3 months and had finally been overruled on the specific legal grounds that Seraphine had spent those same 3 months preparing. She took it from him without ceremony. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have been moving toward for a long time and have now arrived at, and the look was not triumph. Triumph was for people who had not paid the price. The look was something quieter and more durable. The look of a woman who had finished what her father started and was now, finally, beginning something of her own. She looked at Vaelor. He was watching her with the quality of attention that he had spent a year learning to sustain, the attention of a man who had stopped deciding what things were before he looked at them. You never asked, she said very quietly, so that only he could hear it, whether I was ready. Are you? He said. She looked at the court, 600 faces, the rebuilt architecture of an empire still finding its new shape, still working out the load-bearing implications of having removed the rot from its foundations, still uncertain about whether it would hold. It might not hold perfectly. It might not hold without cost. The things worth holding rarely did. She looked at the man beside her. Yes, she said, and meant it. Amt. The Black Ledger was archived in Lord Commander Haith's military tribunal records, where it remained as the foundational document of the Aurethian Reform Tribunal. The case was never returned to Valacrest. Seraphine did not ask for it back. She did not need it anymore. The work it had made possible was more permanent than any document, and documents, she had learned from her father, were only ever a means to an end. The end was this, the empire standing, the work continuing, the asking, still ongoing, every day. That was enough.